It's not possible to understand mental health or have insight to any degree to mental health without understanding the thinking mind. And we don't understand the thinking mind. The thinking mind doesn't understand the thinking mind, and we usually operate on the basis of the thinking mind. And that's why we have a blind spot there. This is quite an odd business, because on the one hand, we absolutely do. We think that we understand everything about thought, how it works, because we're so familiar with it. It doesn't seem like something that we need to actually focus on. And on the other hand, we do have a habit of talking about the thinking mind or the mind and saying, what a strange thing it is, how odd it is, how unfathomable it is, as if we could never understand it. So we do those two things at the same time. We take the mind for granted, and we, from time to time, say how funny it is, how hard to understand it is. But there is always a confusion here, because when we talk about the mind, we could be talking about the mind in capital letters, at least with the M in capital letters, as to mean more than just thought. Or we could be talking about the thinking mind. And I think there's confusion about that because we don't really separate the two. We don't see the thinking mind as being an adjunct of mind or consciousness or the psyche or whatever we want to call it. So there's confusion there. It's kind of as if we think that thought is the great thing that we must pay lip service to, when it isn't thought. Thought is really, compared to the psyche or compared to consciousness, it's a really rather rudimentary affair. It's not as mysterious as all that at all. So in as much as it isn't mysterious, we can say what it is. We can explain it quite straightforwardly. And the simplest way to do this is just to say that thought works by doing something. And what it does, it creates boundaries, as simple as that. Now, thought has to create boundaries. It has to do that itself, because there aren't any boundaries otherwise. And that's an odd thing for us to understand, because we're so used to thinking in terms of boundaries. We think they're naturally occurring features of the universe. But that absolutely isn't so. There are no beginnings and endings. There are no cut-off points. That's purely a framework that we use, and are so used to using it that we no longer see it as a framework. And in Buddhism, this has been known for a long time. And there's a saying in Buddhism, which I first heard watching the television program called Monkey, which was made in Hong Kong based on a Chinese myth. And Monkey ends up working for the greater good, even though he absolutely doesn't want to, starting off with, he really doesn't want to help. He's just interested in helping himself. But anyway, throughout the program, they have these kind of mottos, little Buddhist mottos. And one of them, which I remember, is nothing ends, but it changes, which shows the key difference between Eastern thought and Western thought. Because we're very keen on things ending and beginning. It's very, very significant to us, and we see everything in terms of beginnings and endings, as if these are real things and not just arbitrary starting off points or cutting off points that we ourselves have decided upon. So this really distorts our way of understanding reality in a tremendous way. We only have to think about conventional or exoteric, as it's also sometimes called, Christianity. And it all starts with this big creation, obviously. No prizes for knowing that. And it ends with Armageddon, so there's creation and there's the end of everything. And this is really significant to us. It really is. And we find it hard to see that how being obsessed with illusory beginnings and endings actually detracts from reality itself, which is beginningless and endless, which is where it's at. Any experience of reality is always beginningless and endless, and all we ever have is an experience of reality. And yet we make such a song and dance and get so excited, either in a good way or bad way, about endings. And this isn't a surprise, because we're living in a thought-based way, and thought is all about boundaries or limits. And so, of course, we get super excited about the very big boundary that comes between when there was nothing and when there was something, and then when the universe ceases to exist, which is when there is something and then there is nothing again. So that really has a grip on us. And we can see that when we think about the way in which people go on about the end of the world, if they do go on about the end of the world, which they do sometimes, we do sometimes. This has such a hold on our imagination. The end is nigh, as the message goes. It's like really, really means a lot to us. And if we just said, instead of the end is nigh, because there are no ends really, if we said change is nigh, that wouldn't be the same thing at all. It wouldn't have that same effect on our consciousness, because change is always nigh. There never was a time when it wasn't nigh, and so it's not like some kind of big alien event. It's just the way things are. But we kind of hang everything on this big weird event, such as the end of everything. And that really does just show that we are living life in a thought-based way. And so what thought takes as fundamental, so do we take it as fundamental, which isn't good for us. Because, as I have just said, it detracts from the experience of reality. We're more obsessed with our demarcations, which we ourselves made, than we are with what we are demarking, which is that is ridiculous, obviously. So here we have this infinitely subtle and profound, and whatever else words you might want to use, reality for reality. And it's a never-ending source of amazement and complexity and depth. But instead we create these finite cutting off points, and we put our attention on them as if there's anything to them, because the limit is only just a limit, and it's not a real thing. It's just where we decided to stop looking. So when we get to the end of creation, the end of the universe, there is this boundary there between the universe and whatever we imagine to be on the other side, which is nothing. But how can there be nothing? Because if there's nothing, that must be something, because whenever you get a boundary or a barrier, it always has two faces, two sides. And what a boundary really means is that we're excluding something. We're saying we're not going to look any further. We're not going to think any further. We're just going to call this the end and treat it as if anything on the other side of it doesn't matter. And so there isn't anything on the other side of the boundary. It's because it's a blind spot, because we're willfully not looking at it. But there would be something there if we looked at it. But we, in order to play our games, we refuse to admit that anything exists there. And we also refuse to admit that we're refusing to admit this, which is entropy. So really what we're talking about is entropy. Ends and beginnings, because we refuse to look at things in the way which means a beginning isn't a beginning, and because we refuse to look at things in the way that means an end isn't an end, we're incurring entropy, we're using entropy. There's something there, but we don't know about it, and we don't want to know that we don't know about it. So there's this the double ignorance of entropy. And then once we do that, once we partition everything off, we create a particular type of pseudo-reality or virtual reality. We create the reality which is totally founded upon our boundaries, our formatting, because that's what boundaries are. That's how we format reality for ourselves. And all of that depends on entropy, which isn't a real thing. It is, in reality, there isn't any entropy. We have to actually ignore something and then ignore the fact that we're ignoring it, or throw something away and forget that we threw it away. Or maybe a better way to say it is to say we have to forget something and then we forget that we forgot it, so it's as if it isn't there. But it is, it's just us the entropy exists for. So that's boundaries, that's beginnings and endings. Now this might not seem to have a hell of a lot to do with mental health, but it absolutely does. It has everything to do with mental health. And it is necessary for us to go into entropy and boundaries and limits and rules, which are all words for the same thing, in order to have any insight at all into mental health. And the reason we can say this is because the biggest boundary of all, or the most central boundary of all, is, of course, the boundary between self and not self. Because without the boundary between self and not self, there is no self, and everything we do is based upon the notion of self, clearly. Apart from the odd time when we forget ourselves. That's okay. We do forget ourselves, but on the whole, we orientate ourselves via the self, which is created by a boundary. And to go back to what I started off by saying, all boundaries have to be drawn. Ourselves, we have to draw it. We have to make that boundary because there aren't any. So what we have here is a very, very strange situation. The self exists because I drew the boundary myself between, or rather thought draws the boundary, because that's what thought does, but I'm on board with what thought does. I'm throwing my lot in with thought. I'm saying to thought, do your thing, make the boundaries, and then I'll live as if the boundaries are real. So then we get the self. And the self is the self precisely because we have forgotten that the boundary is just a made-up thing. We've forgotten that we're deliberately looking at things in a narrow way, and then acting as if this narrow way is the only way. But the narrow way is never the only way, because if we just step back a bit and look beyond that, we say, hey, wow, it's not narrow at all, because the boundaries that make it narrow aren't really there. We made them. So the narrowness of living life on the basis of the self is the same thing as the narrowness that comes about by incurring entropy. Because without entropy, without that ignorance of which we are ignorant, without our refusal to admit that there is a wider view than the view we habitually use, we create the self, or the self creates the self, which sounds very strange, naturally enough. It's one of those things that you can't really tell people about that without them looking at you and thinking, well, that's stupid, and just kind of discounting it straight away. But it's worth persevering with all the same. The idea of things that create themselves isn't unheard of after all. In physics, it's called bootstrapping. And bootstrapping was fashionable in the 70s, I think, or somewhere like that. And I think it's come back a little bit now. But the point is, I think it's come back quite a lot now. But the point is that we can understand how it can work in a kind of a way, if not in a logical way. I don't think the thinking mind can quite understand it, but we can understand it. So what that means is the primary business of living from the point of view of thought, and from our point of view, because we're living on the basis of thought, as I keep saying, is that we have to maintain the boundary. Everything is about maintaining the boundary. That boundary is very, very important to us. We don't know that we made it up. We think it's real. But on another level, we do have to maintain it because it won't be there otherwise. So we split in two. There's the part of us which just thinks the boundary is a feature of reality itself. That's the part we're aware of. And there's the other part of us which has to feverishly work away, maintaining the boundary, making sure it doesn't get rubbed out or dissolved, because who knows what would happen then. Now, this really leads straight on to anxiety, because what I'm doing here, I'm saying it's absolutely important that I maintain this boundary at the same time as it being the case that that boundary never existed and never will do. So we've got a situation here. I'm predicating my whole existence as the mind created self on this thing where it is absolutely important that what isn't true should be true. Now, it's not too hard to work out that basing everything on that is an extraordinarily dodgy kind of a thing to do, because no matter, surely I could find something better to base my peace of mind on, base my well-being on, than the task of making what is not true be true, which is what we have all done implicitly by living on the basis of thought. Now, as soon as we see that, or are prepared at least to entertain that as a notion, we can see how anxiety is actually intrinsic to the nature of the self. Anxiety is always going to be intrinsic or inherent in the life of the mind-created self, because for the mind-created self, only one thing really is important, and that is for it to believe that it really and truly does exist. And this one thing, which is the most important thing for the self, also happens to be totally untrue. So there's no way that can't be a recipe for anxiety. And any idea that we can cure anxiety with some fancy therapy, so that then the mind-created self, the extrinsic self, the concrete identity, etc., can have this marvelous life without anxiety, everything will be great then. But how can it? How can it ever rid itself of its anxiety when its basis is what we have just said its basis is? So we can see that any talk of eliminating anxiety via cognitive type therapies, thinking type therapies, is outrageously stupid. It is just, in fact, when we do talk about that, and when we do believe in rational therapies as having the potential to cure our anxiety, what this is is just yet another way in which thought is trying to deny reality. So it's another level of denial. It's like building a pagoda with lots of levels. So we've just built another level with what sounds like an admirable kind of a thing. Here we have a fantastic therapy. Maybe it's even evidence-based. It could be evidence-based, and how brilliant is that? And yet, this is the real point. No matter how much evidence, in inverted commas, we have, it doesn't matter. There could be reams and reams and reams of it. You could fill up 1,000 million scientific journals with it. If the thought-created self, which we are identifying with, doesn't exist, how on earth can there be any way of eliminating that anxiety, which is actually our relationship with the truth? The rest of it's all bullshit. It's a mind-created fantasy. The rest of it's samsara. But this edge of anxiety, that's our relationship with truth itself. So what we're trying to do with our clever therapies is eliminate truth, because truth is the fly in the ointment. The truth is that rotten thing that it just won't go away. But we have fantasies of making it go away. And wouldn't that be wonderful? Obviously, we don't see ourselves as thinking it's wonderful to get rid of truth, but that's what we are doing because of our inverted way of looking at things. So this just goes to show that very stupidly we keep using this word evidence, and we keep going on and on about research as if science involves nothing else but crushing people beneath mounds of evidence, however spuriously obtained, when actually half of science is the clear understanding or insight into the nature of things. And you can perform experiments to see whether your understanding is true or not. But we don't have that understanding. We don't have any clear understanding of anything. And if we were to have a clear understanding, which is a type of insight any of us could get, as to the unreal nature, or in Buddhism they'd say the impermanent nature, meaning that it comes into existence, apparent existence, only to move out of existence again. So it's always changing. So if it's always changing, there's nothing there to change, because there's only change. And we want there to be something which doesn't change, which we can cling to for security and say, this is the self, or this is my idea of the world, this is my belief of the world, in total denial of impermanence, which is flow, basically. We want to freeze everything solid. So if we have understanding about that, which any of us can have for ourselves, because it's no good anyone else telling us about it, then we see so clearly that nothing can get rid of the anxiety, which is part and parcel of the extrinsic self, the self who we think we are. And if we have that understanding, we start to realize how ludicrously absurd it is to carry on in life being unaware of our true nature of who we are, or the true nature of how thought works, and despite not being interested in the actual nature of things, live a life which is not anxious, that is peaceful, that there is peace of mind in it. And there can be peace of mind, there can be the absence of anxiety, but only when we stop clinging to this false idea of who we think we are, which isn't such a great idea anyway. Okay, thanks for watching.